What is up, YouTube friends and fam? And if you're new to the page, welcome. So it's almost 2024, and say you're looking to become a photographer, or you're looking to upgrade your gear that you currently have. I've compiled a list of 24 different cameras in 3 different price brackets that I would highly recommend. Let's go ahead and dig into these. So before we get started, I want to lay some ground rules on this video. This is only going to be new cameras and body only, no lenses included. Just to keep things simple. I also want to say I am going to be referencing some notes throughout this because I just have far too much information that I can have memorized in this noggin here. Now, in most of these situations, they are going to be offered with a kit lens. I'd highly recommend going with like a nifty 50 or potentially getting a used lens to have better image quality. The kit lenses typically do not have wider apertures and are not able to work in low light situations, and they're usually not as sharp as something like a 50mm 1.8, which is going to be your cheapest kind of entry-level lens, or some used, more professional level glass. Now, with that being said, that's not to say that used cameras can't offer some really, really great specs, especially if you're just a photographer and not looking to do video. If you're looking for a used list, comment below and let me know, because I will be happy to put one of those together. I love old cameras, and in fact, one of my current favorites that I'm using right now is an old Canon 5D, and this is the original 5D. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, real quick, before we also get into this, if you're not already subscribed to the page, could you go ahead and do that for me? Currently, only 1% of our video viewers are actually subscribers. So, subscribing helps the page grow, liking this video, all that fun stuff, but I'm not going to pull your leg too much on that. We have broken this down into 3 different categories, as stated before. We're going to do an under $600 range, a under $1,200 range, and then a $1,200 to $1,700 range. And the reason I chose those is because it's kind of where most of these cameras fall in different categories. It kind of gives options for people that are working in different budgets, and you know, not everyone has the money to go spend $1,500 on a camera right off the bat. So I wanted to make sure to include, you know, different variations of different prices and what you're going to get at those price points. We're going to get some cinematic fog in the room. All right. Starting off in the under $600 range, we are going to list camera number 1, which is the Canon R100. Now, the Canon R100 is basically your entry-level mirrorless camera. It is an APS-C crop sensor, and it starts out around $499. What's cool about this camera is it does feature a Digic 8 24 megapixel sensor. So, good sensor. Not necessarily the greatest autofocus, but functional. It is the lightest R camera in the series, and it does give you access to some phenomenal EF glass with an adapter, and then, of course, the current RF line of lenses, which are also very great. The cool thing with the RF lenses is, even though there's not a huge selection of them, the lower end selection are very good. Honestly, one of my most used lenses is a RF 35mm 1.8, and typically for video and stuff like that, that's where I'm going to go. That and the 24 to 105, which is an L series lens, the f4, and you can get it for less than $1,000 for professional glass, which is pretty impressive. Touching on that, it is dual pixel, which most of these Canon cameras that we're going to cover are. And if you've been here before, you know how much I like Canons. It's 1080p 60 frames per second and can do 4K 24. It is, as stated before, a mirrorless design, has integrated Bluetooth functionality, can do continuous shooting up to 6.5 frames per second, which isn't great, but if you're not doing anything like wildlife or sports, you know, you don't really have a need of going faster than that. It takes one singular SD UHS 1 slot, so not the fastest cards, but, you know, it'll work. And it does shoot RAW, which I think is, with cameras at this kind of price point, you're going to see more that are JPEG onlys. And I think now that we're moving forward in this design, You will see more cameras at this price point that are producing RAWs, but it is kind of a misnomer that a camera this low of price will produce a RAW image. And those are full 14 bits. It also supports 8-bit H.264, so you're not going to get a flat color profile. You're going to get your typical standard picture profiles that you can record in. This camera is going to be great for younger audiences. You're not even, I wouldn't say hobbyist photographers, but like your family photographers. It does have a built-in flash, which is pretty cool. Those can be great for, you know, taking photos around the house or taking photos of the kids. If you're looking at doing anything a little bit more on the serious end, I would stay away from this one and upgrade to the next camera, number 2, which is the R50. So the R50 is also an APS-C camera. It's going to start around $599, and it's going to be a huge upgrade from the R100. It is a Digic X processor, which is Canon's newest processor. So it's going to share a very watered-down version of the R3's processor. It has phenomenal autofocus. It's also very lightweight, and this is kind of a crazy thing at this price point at, you know, under $600. It is 4K up to 30 frames per second, which is downsampled from 6K. So this is probably the only camera that you're going to see, you know, under $700 that's going to do this. It does have movie modes and product close-ups, which for vloggers or for, you know, content creators is going to work very well. Features continuous shooting up to 12 frames per second with electronic first curtain and 15 frames per second with electronic only. What we've seen, you know, currently, especially with the Canons, because they have not introduced a global shutter yet, is that with the electronic shutters, if something's moving at a high speed, you are going to get some of that jello effect. So I always shoot in electronic first curtain, mostly mechanical shutter. I've not experienced any of these new Digic X processors because I'm running an R5 and a R6. We do have an R7 that I very rarely get to use, and I will say we've not used it on electronic curtain either. So can't really comment on that. It's not really something that comes across with us, and we are functioning at, you know, a higher level than a hobbyist. One UHS-1 SD card slot, also access to adapted EF lenses and RF lenses, does shoot in RAWs, and you are going to get a 10-bit HEIF format for video in this. Personally, in this price bracket, this is going to be the camera I take, which, factoring in the Canon glass that I have and just my tendency to like Canon cameras over many of the other competitors, you know, I might be a little bit biased. But moving on to number 3, we have a Sony. So the Sony ZV E10 is our number 3. This is probably the best overall camera out of this grouping. It's going to come in at $598. It's also a 24 megapixel Bionz X processor. This is a APS-C camera, and it is also going to feature 4K downsampled from 6K. I do believe that is only up to 30 frames per second as well. With Sony's, you get access to the E-mount and a variety of third-party lenses, notably Sigma, which has produced some very sharp, very contrasty glass. Sony has a phenomenal autofocus system, and I'm not even going to knock that. You know, I do like my Canons, but the Sony was kind of the progenitor of this new autofocusing system with phase and contrast detect hybrid autofocus. It does have, it does shoot RAW files, and it does have digital in-body or digital image stabilization. So not in-body, you know, optical stabilization, but it is going to give you a slight crop and give you that image stabilization factor. It's unlimited recording at 4K 30, which most of these cameras you're probably going to see a 30-minute time limit on. These are only 8-bit video files, but they are 422. So a little bit more flexibility than a straight 8-bit 420. But not as much flexibility in post-production as a 10-bit video file. This is also going to be a single UHS-1 SD card slot. Coming in at number 4 on our list is going to be a Sony ZV1F. So This is going to be a pocketable, technically, I guess it would be a point-and-shoot camera, and it's going to come in at $398. It's a 20mm fixed f2.0 lens. This could be a deal breaker for some people, and not having the flexibility of an interchangeable lens system. For some people, like content creators, this is going to be great. 20 megapixel Exmor RS sensor. What that means to me is nothing. Up to 16 frames per second continuous shooting, but only 3.5 frames per second using the full spec. So that's shooting in RAW, the highest bit rates, etc. This is also a single UHS-1 SD slot. Here's where it comes in: is it only shoots JPEGs, is from what I'm reading. That's a huge deal breaker for me. I want the flexibility of having a RAW file, even if I'm, not necessarily going to use it. And like the camera that we're shooting on right now, the XS20, I mostly use JPEGs, but if I do need to pull more data, I have that ability to shoot RAW. So it's going to do 4K 25, is the highest bit rate, or the highest video codec that I could find, and 1080p 60. Moving forward, at number 5, it is another Sony. You're going to see a lot of Sonys on this list, and sorry about it, but Sony makes good cameras. I like my Canons. I like my Fujis. I'm starting to take some interest in the Olympus OM systems, but Sony's probably the best on the market right now. They produce a ton of cameras. They know what they're doing. I will say Sony is a camera, and in my personal opinion, Canon is a photographer's camera. So, whatever. But moving on to number 5 is the A6100. You're going to get those for $598. It's a 24 megapixel APS-C sensor. It does pretty much all the same things that we've talked about in the previous two Sonys, but it is going to do 4K 120 at a decreased bit rate, so you will have access to slow motion, and one UHS, one card slot. We're going to move on from that one pretty quickly because it's an older camera and probably not the top of my list in this price bracket. Coming in at number 6, the Lumix G100, and this is a micro four thirds blogger that does feature IBIS. So that's the first optical image stabilization that we're going to see in this price bracket. And that is going to start at $497. Now, the cool thing with these Lumix is you get access to the Leica L mount. So you can buy Lumix lenses, but you can also buy Leica lenses. And Leica is probably the best glass on the market. It is a little bit more expensive, but it being a micro four thirds, you don't have the weight that is accustomed to it. You don't have the extra glass that is built into it. So it will give you a little bit of a cost-cutting effect. And that's something to factor in versus a Canon full frame, which all of your RF glass, except for like 2 RFS lenses, are all full frame. And they can get quite expensive. So back to the Lumix G100. This does, it's actually not an interchangeable. I stand corrected. It is a 12 to 32 millimeter 3.5 to 5.6. It does shoot RAW files. It does 4K 30 and H.264 codec, and it is contrast autofocus only. So that would be a deal breaker for me. Contrast autofocus is outdated at this point. It's not the most reliable, and especially like in a video situation, I wouldn't trust contrast autofocus to, reliably track me. So this is going to be, a vlogger, a very light, almost pocketable, or like throwing a crossbody sling camera and kind of take anywhere. I don't feel that this camera offers any more than, the ZV1F or potentially the ZV E10. Those are probably going to be my two choices if you're more of a content creator, but this does come in at a decent price, fixed lens, and it has, the zoom ability. And then rounding out this price segment is a camera that's, $5 out of this price range, but I figured it was close enough if you throw in like a 10% coupon or something, That is the Nikon Z30. And what I've read on this camera is that it is basically the Swiss Army knife of cameras at this price point. It's a 20 megapixel APS-C sensor. It does 12-bit lossless compressed and 14-bit raw files, so it's going to give you the most flexibility out of, you know, your photo files. It can shoot 11 frames per second, and that is at full resolution, so that's pretty cool. Gives you creative picture controls, hybrid autofocus, which is going to give you contrast and phase detect autofocus. Great variety of Nikon lenses, and there is now that F to Z mount, so access to old Nikon lenses if you'd like that, and access to new Z mount lenses, which Nikon's got some pretty good glass out there. I wouldn't say personally that it's up to the Canon standard, and that's, again, just a personal opinion and preference, but like the new Nikon 135 Plina is a beautiful piece of machinery and produces some of the best images that I've seen. It's going to give you access to 4K 30 and 1080p up to 120, so another camera that's giving us slow motion, and an H.264 codec. So this is, you know, kind of a great all-arounder. It's going to do great photos. 20 megapixels in that APS-C format is plenty most of the time. You're mostly not going to need more than that unless you're a pixel peeper or doing like wildlife heavy cropping. And if you're moving into the wildlife segment, I'd recommend kind of moving up in your price segment as well, because the autofocus is going to be better and et cetera, et cetera. But the Z30 is probably my second or third choice out of this price segment. And, you know, number one's going to be the Canon R50. Number two, I'm probably taking the ZV E10, and then number three, I'm going to take the Nikon Z30. If you have hand-me-down lenses and, you know, an ecosystem that you're already built into, like I was with Canon, that might be the way that you want to lean. All three of those cameras are going to be, you know, great. And that's going to close out the under $600 segment. Let's move on to the next one. So that's going to wrap up tier one of our best cameras going into the 2024 list. Going into tier 2, we are going to look from the $650 range to the $1,200 range. And what we're going to get out of this range is some cameras that have some more special features, some higher specs, but also ones that are going to be more niche-based. So you will see some cameras here that are better for landscape and wildlife photographers, some that are more geared towards video, some that are geared more towards, you know, potentially wedding photographers. So that is something that is to keep in mind, and I'm going to try, as we're discussing each camera, to kind of say which area of photography that I think that it would be best suited. So topping off this list, at number 1, we have the Sony ZV1 Mark II. And this is going to be a great vlogger. It's an entry-level video camera. It has some great AI features. And you're going to see this camera around $798. It is a 20.1 megapixel sensor. It's an Exmor RS 1-inch. It has some great video features, product showcasing, Sony's infamous AI autofocus features, things like that. It is a fixed 18 to 50 millimeter 1.8 to f4 lens, so not interchangeable lenses, which again can be a deal breaker for some people. There is a 3-directional audio mic on there, so from everything that I've heard, these mics are great, and you can kind of direct which way you want the sound to go, whether it be forward facing, backward facing, or a mix of both. Real-time focus tracking and eye autofocus. So most of these cameras in this segment are going to have eye autofocus, and they're going to be hybrid phase and contrast detect focusing mechanisms. It has great digital image stabilization, so not a optical in-body image stabilization. There will be a slight crop factor with that, but still a good vlogger from everything that I'm seeing with like arm's length or even holding it on like a Joby GorillaPod. You're going to be fine as far as framing. Easy access to 5 different looks and 4 different moods on the camera. It's going to be a pocketable one. You will get a tally lamp and tally frame on this camera, and it is stream and webcam ready. So, closing off the Sony ZV1 Mark II. Next up, we are going to have the Nikon Z5. This is going to be a photography forward camera, and most of these Nikons are, not that they don't do great with video, but as far as like you're going to see with the Canons and the Sonys, they're going to be a little bit more functional for video. Now, for content creation and for YouTube videos and stuff like that, a Nikon's going to be fine. So the Z5 has decent autofocus. It's not quite up to the standards of like the Nikon Z8 or the Z9, and definitely not industry standard like Sony and Canon. But for the most part, it's going to be functional. It is the first full frame that we have on this list, so you will get that shallower depth of field and access to all the different lenses. It is a 24 megapixel. It does compressed 12-bit RAW and 14-bit lossless RAW. 5-axis in-body image stabilization, so it will have that actual optical image stabilization. And this is the first camera on the list that has 2 UHS 2 slots. So you will have a little bit of built-in redundancy, and if you want to use this for something like weddings or portraits, it's going to be a safer bet than something with a single UHS 1 card. Hybrid autofocus, as stated earlier, so it is phase detect and contrast. It just doesn't have quite the algorithms that Canon and Sony has. 4K video up to 30 frames per second and 1080p 60 with focus peaking. So I do believe this is going to be the first camera in this list that does have focus peaking. And for those that don't know, focus peaking is going to put on your camera, not on the actual like exported data. It's going to put a line, typically red, green, or blue, highlight to show you what is in focus while you're recording. It has focus shift shooting, and it is weather sealed. That's going to be pretty much all of the specs and features that you get with the Nikon Z5. People like the Nikon Z5, and it seems like the Nikons kind of are the like do everything but not necessarily master all of it. Nikon does have beautiful colors, I will say that. Next up is going to be a great landscape and wildlife camera, and probably out of this segment, it's going to be the cheapest, but also for your landscape, like hikers, people that are trekking out, overlander guys. It's small, it's portable, it's compatible with a lot of stuff, and it's easy to carry, cheap entry level point, and cheap lenses because it's a micro four thirds camera. And I don't know if you're going to be able to tell what company we're going with here, but it is Olympus. And that is the Olympus EM10 Mark IV. So it's lightweight, has built-in image stabilization. It is a 20 megapixel TruePic 8 micro four thirds sensor. Classic body styling, you can get it in black or silver. As stated before, it does have IBIS, and this is kind of the deal breaker for me. It is only contrast detect autofocus. So if you're looking at doing portraits or maybe even family photos or stuff like that, this isn't the camera that I would go for. If you are going to be strictly a landscape shooter, the astrophotography shooters, and even somewhat to wildlife, wildlife may be hit or miss on this, but this is going to be like a good entry-level camera for you. It does 4K 30 and 1080p 60 in H.264. I'm not seeing great results on Olympus video from this specific model, so that may be something to factor in. I would probably, between this and the next camera on our list, I would go with the next one if you can swing the extra $300 that it's going to cost. And that is going to be the Olympus OM5. So another great landscape and wildlife camera. The OM5 is going to be a TruePic 9 sensor, so it's a generation newer. It is still a 20 megapixel micro four thirds. It has quad pixel autofocus with phase and contrast, so it's going to be a hybrid focusing system. This is going to be significantly better than the Olympus EM10 Mark IV, which, mouthful here. But this also does feature in-body image stabilization, so it's going to be optical image stabilization, and then I believe you can crop in as well. Pre-shooting buffer, I think this is potentially the first time that we're seeing this on the list, and pre-shooting buffer, with wildlife is a great thing to have, or even with, sports. Not necessary for landscape or anything like that, but it's a cool feature to have. It does do a handheld high-res shot. I believe this comes out to 80 megapixels. So the way that this functions is essentially it utilizes that in-body image stabilization, which this is a 5-axis one, and it's going to shift that sensor and take a picture here and shift and take a picture here and shift and take a picture here and then one more time. So it will give you a lot of data in one photo. Now, it does compress that into a JPEG, so I do believe the flexibility with your editing is going to be a little bit less, but if you're not someone that, highly pushes all your colors or your highlights or your shadows, this can be a great feature to have. 4K 30 in OM log 400. This is only 8-bit though, so you do get the benefit of extra dynamic range with a log profile. But it being only 8-bit, you're still not going to have the flexibility that you would have with a 10-bit file. That is going to close out the 2 Olympuses that we have in this segment here. And we're going to get to some Sonys. So next up is a crop sensor Sony. It's the A6600. This is going to come in just under $1,000. I believe it's like $998 right now. It's a 24.2 megapixel APS-C sensor. It does have in-body image stabilization and super fast autofocus. So Sony's notorious, and they kind of pioneered this autofocus that we're getting in these mirrorless cameras. And for a while there, it was everyone trying to keep up with them. I do believe Canon has gotten to that point now, and I actually kind of have a preference towards the Canon autofocus. I feel like I get more takeaway shots with it, but to each their own. It has real-time tracking and eye autofocus, so it's going to grab onto those, and you can change your settings and make them stick really well. It's 11 frames per second, 46 burst buffer in RAW. So faster than a lot of what we've seen so far. Not necessarily the fastest that you're going to see. It's going to do 4K 30 and 1080p 60 in 422, again with the 8-bit. So 8-bits, it's going to be fine for most things. If you're doing more creative stuff and you want to push your color grades and things like that, 8-bit's going to be a limiting factor for you. But if you're looking to create kind of more natural looking images and just push things a little bit here and there and not really delve into like something like DaVinci Resolve where you're really pushing heavy color grades with node trees and stuff like that, this is going to be fine. Moving on to our next camera on this list, and that is the Fujifilm XS10. Now, I am currently filming on the XS10's little brother, the XS20, and it's probably my favorite camera in the bag, and that's coming from someone that shoots on an R5, an R6, an R7. We have a 5D Classic, and I like cameras, and this is the camera that offers everything that I could possibly want. It has great picture profiles, and you're going to see this in the Fujifilm XS10 as well. So this is going to be an X-Trans 4 sensor. It's going to offer 18 different film simulations. It is a backside illuminated sensor, and it's 26.1 megapixels. 5-axis in-body image stabilization. I keep having trouble with that word. One UHS-1 slot, not a huge deal. Can it be a deal breaker for some? Maybe. I don't think it's going to be at this price point and at this level of photography. I am kind of skeptical using this thing for weddings sometimes, but it is what it is. Next up, you do have access to the Fuji lenses, of course, and then Viltrox, which we are shooting on the Viltrox 13mm right now. Viltrox is putting out some really impressive and affordable glass for these Fujifilms now. There are adapters that you can use, which you can use pretty much adapters for anything, but we actually have one coming in soon. It's a Fringer Mark III Canon EF to X mount, so we're going to be using Canon EF glass on this Fujifilm here soon too. But Viltrox, back to Viltrox. Cheap lenses, sharp lenses, fast lenses, and they're very well built from everything that I've seen. We've got 2 so far, and both metal body, good autofocus, so that's something to factor in. They're all APS-C size lenses, so they are cheaper, they're significantly lighter, and every camera doesn't always call for, or every situation doesn't always call for a full frame camera. Shoots up to 30 frames per second, but only 17 frames of that you're going to get raw, so you are going to have like a half a second shooting time on that. It is intelligent hybrid autofocus, so you're going to get that phase and contrast autofocus. Not as good as Sony or Canon, but I've not noticed any issues with either of the Fujifilms that I've had. Getting the focusing system, like getting used to it, is a little wonky if you are familiar with either of those systems, but I would assume that you're not going to be downgrading from something like an R6, so you probably don't have the luxury of eye autofocus and, you know, different subject detection, etc. You're going to get H.264 and long op recording, 4K 30 and 1080p up to 240 frames per second. So I think this is the highest frames per second that we've seen so far, and that's going to give you some pretty significant slow-mo. You're going to essentially be able to down to 10% of what you would be shooting at. So pretty cool. I have not had a ton of uses for that, but I do go to 120 quite a bit on this camera. You're going to get an F-Log on this. It's 8-bit 420. You can do 10-bit external to something like a Ninja. And touching back on that, we get 10-bit on the XS20. Bringing around to another Fujifilm, and this is going to be more of a photography forward, less of a hybrid camera, but you're going to get a lot of the same specs with this. The XT30 Mark II. So same sensor as the XS10, many of the same features. It is backside illuminated sensor. It does not have IBIS, so it's going to come in a little bit cheaper at $899 instead of $999, which is the Fujifilm XS10's price range. The XT30 Mark II is going to be more compact. It's going to fit more places, and me personally, like if I was going for street photography, I would go with the XT30 Mark II. Another cool thing with the XT30s is you get that either black body or silver body. That's just a preference. It's not going to affect your photographs, but if you want to throw some style into your photography kit, that's a way to do it. We have the first Canon in this tier list, and that is going to be the R10. The R10 is basically the R7 but stripped down. So great autofocus, good video features, especially at this price point. It's going to come in at $879. The primary things that it doesn't have that the R7 has is the in-body image stabilization and a slightly lower resolution sensor. So the sensor on it is going to be the 24.2 Digic X. It does share a focusing system and algorithm with like heavy hitters like the R3, and we've seen in the R7, like, it is phenomenal. It's fast, it's accurate, you can make it as sticky as you want to, and the R10 is going to give you kind of the same features. It's a single UHS 2 card slot, so you're not going to get the redundancy cards like you would on the R7, but again, not a big deal if you're using this for like content creation or wildlife or landscape, something like that. This is also going to function really well as a portrait camera, and Canons are what we use for pretty much all of our professional work, so something to consider. You will get up to 15 frames per second on the mechanical shutter on this, and 23 frames per second electronic. Didn't see any numbers on the buffer there, but I would assume it's fairly low. You're going to get 4K 30 MP4s, and those are downsampled from 6K. So you're getting a 6K image with an $879 camera, and that to me is insane. 1080p up to 120, so you'll get super smooth slow-mo. And this is just speaking from personal experience with this sensor. These sensors are good in low light up to 6400 ISO before they start falling apart. And even then, the grain is somewhat tasteful on these, so you're not going to have things that just are like muddy and gross looking even till you push that a little bit higher. So if you are kind of a low light shooter or someone that kind of works in different varying conditions, that may be something to consider, is that you can push this camera comfortably up to 6400 ISO before your image starts falling apart. 16-bit RAW and HDR photos and 10-bit HDR video. You do not get a log profile with this, so kind of a bummer. I've seen some workarounds with this where someone will go in and create their own profile and just flatten everything out as much as possible. That's going to give you some slight advantages to the dynamic range, and you are getting 10-bit files out of this at least. So the next camera on this list is a little bit of a curveball. It is a point and shoot. It is not saturated with video features. It is a photography forward point and shoot camera. And sound off in the comments below real quick if you know what this is. And if you guessed, let me know. I'll give you a little round of applause. It is not from any of the big competitors. It is not from a super well-known company. It is the Reiko GR3. And why I put this camera on this list is there is a special type of photographer that is going to like this camera, and that's mostly going to be street photographers. But street photographers looking for something very specific. These are beautiful images straight out of camera. Very minimal editing, and this is something that I love with my Fujifilms and being able to throw these film simulations on, but the JPEGs out of these cameras are some of the best JPEGs that I've seen. They have like a nostalgic feel to them, and I'm not going to like beat a dead horse here, but it's kind of something that you have to see. So if you can take a second and go look at the Reiko GR3 images, sample images, you're going to be surprised. It is a $966.95 camera. There are a bunch of cool limited editions, so if you want to like accessorize with it and stuff like that, there's different colors, ones that have different accent rings, etc., which I think is a cool thing. There's nothing wrong with having options. It's a 24.2 megapixel sensor with a GR Engine 6 processor. 28 millimeter fixed lens, and that's going to be 2.8 at the widest and f16 at the narrowest. It does have image stabilization. It's going to give you 14-bit DNG RAW files, and then this is kind of the lackluster thing. It does 1080p up to 60 in H.264 codec. One single UHS-1 card slot. It is hybrid autofocus, and it is pocketable. So this is kind of a niche camera, and it's not going to be a camera for everyone. I understand that, but if I was buying a camera just to strictly shoot, JPEGs and something that I could throw in a pocket or a fanny pack, or I think it would even fit in like a shirt pocket, this is the route that I'm going. And they look cool. That's really a big determining factor for me on these. Getting away from the weirder cameras, we're going to go to a Lumix, and this is going to be the GH5 Mark II. And the reason this is on the list is it is a feature-packed video-first camera. It's a good hybrid, but this is going to be, you guys that are looking to get more into video, this is where you're going to want to look, is the Panasonic and the Lumix line. Not that Sony doesn't have offerings, not that Canon doesn't have offerings, but I think Lumix just has something special here. And, they have fans, they have what seems to be better temperature regulation than some of the bigger brands, so something to consider. This is a 20 megapixel micro four thirds sensor. It is capable of live streaming, and it is capable of 4K 60 in 10-bit 420. So full 10-bit, you're going to have the flexibility and the malleability on these files, and that's with no crop. It's also going to do 10-bit 422 and 4K 30, and it does have a long op option, so long op is always welcome because it gives you a little bit more extended recording time and not really much loss, if any, in quality. It does have in-body image stabilization, and it has Vlog. There's some speculation on this Vlog situation. So typical Vlog is going to give you, I think, 13.5 stops of dynamic range. And they give you Vlog L in this camera, which is only going to give you 12 stops of dynamic range. But that's, can go either way. It's not a huge deal. You're going to have to kind of just make sure that you expose properly, which if you're a beginner photographer, that's a great thing to learn anyway. And this camera is going to come in at $997. The one key feature on this that none of the cameras have had so far that we've talked about is it is anamorphic lens ready. So it's going to have built into the camera a D-squeeze if you do want to buy some of the more expensive like Sirui or Laowa anamorphic lenses. And anamorphic's going to give you that cinematic feel. So if you want to get into filmmaking and entry-level cinematic stuff, this is probably the route to go out of this price point at least. And that is going to close out segment 2 of our best cameras going into 2024. So that was the $650 price range to the $1,200 price range. And you could see most of the time we didn't even get up to that $1,200 range. These were closer to like under $1,000. So we're going to move on to the next one. And this is going to be for all you heavy hitters that are ready to drop some cash on a camera. And these are going to be significantly more feature packed. They are going to give you a lot of different options. Cameras like the R7, which we use for landscape, for wildlife, for video purposes, and it's actually my B camera for when I'm shooting on the R5. We use it for wildlife, we use it for weddings, and we just had it like yesterday on a in-home family portrait shoot. So a lot of cameras you'll see in this price point are going to be jack of all trades, master of quite a few of them. Alright, now before we dive into this part of the list, I do want to say there are better cameras out there. They are more expensive, and basically I had to cut this off at some point. So we are at 24 cameras after this segment, and I know this is already going to be a really long video, and I'm not quite that good at talking yet. So this is the $1,200 to $1,700 segment. You're going to see a lot of very kitted out APS-C sensor cameras. You'll see some full frames in here. I do want to say pretty much any camera that I'm listing at this price point is going to be good. There are going to be ones that are better at some things than others, and there are going to be ones that are just kind of good at everything but not great at everything. With the exception of the R7, it's good at everything. But so we have quite a few out of this portion here, and let's go ahead and get started as soon as I get my notes back up. So $1,200 to $1,700. First camera is going to be my personal pick that I would use at a professional level, and you could easily do weddings with this camera. You could do portrait sessions, again, wildlife, landscapes, things like that. It's a little bit lower on the megapixel end, but that's not a huge deal breaker, especially with all the up-resing that you can do digitally now and everything. And everyone knows that I'm a Canon fanboy, and it is a Canon. So this is going to be the Canon R8, and it is coming in at $1,299 right now. It will go back up because we're kind of seeing those Black Friday, like holiday prices right now. I do think it's commonly around like $1,500, but what you get with this camera at this price point is kind of insane because it's basically an R6 Mark II with no image stabilization and some tweaked video specs. It is a full frame Digic X processor, 24 megapixel sensor. This is probably going to be the best or second best if you're considering Sony better autofocus in this industry right now. At least in the consumer level, I've not had any issues with Canon's autofocus. You grab it, pick out what you want, and then, like we've discussed earlier, you can kind of change your settings on how sticky you want it to be, and it does what it needs to. It is consistent. It's predictable, which I think is a good thing. It's going to give you access to EF and RF lenses, so any of you guys that may have old EF glass laying around or are on a limited budget for lenses because you do need to get, you know, a certain type of body based on what you're going to be doing, EF glass is still very sharp, very beautiful, and honestly, sometimes I like the look of EF glass as opposed to RF because RF can have a kind of clinical look to it. So we do bounce back and forth between some EF lenses and RF lenses, and there's nothing wrong with that, and they adapt really, really well to these R-series bodies. You're going to get H.264 and H.265 codecs. The 4K in this is going to be downsampled from 6K, so super cool, super high resolution, sharp images, and you're going to get a 60 frames per second out of that, and then 1080p up to 180 frames per second. So not quite the 240 that we've seen earlier on this list, but 180 frames per second is going to be plenty for most people when it comes to like slow-mo and that kind of stuff. You will get C-Log 3. I do believe this is the first introduction to C-Log 3 that you're going to see on this list, and C-Log 3 is great. There are some limitations with it, especially in the shadows. You can see like shadows get a little bit muddy with C-Log 3 sometimes. Not a huge deal. And you do get HDR PQ. Hybrid dual pixel autofocus, so contrast and phase detect, and as I've stated earlier, it is phenomenal. It's a phenomenal autofocus system. One single UHS 2 card slot, so you're going to get access to the faster, like the V90s, that will give you faster upload, download speeds, that kind of stuff. And they are stating up to 2 hours continuous streaming or recording. So I'm assuming that is with a constant power source, like a V-mount battery or a dummy battery placed in there, because you're not going to get that out of these new batteries that they've introduced, the LPE17s. They're just not quite as good or as juiced up as the LPE6 NHs. They are cheaper though, and they're smaller, so more pocketable, easier to manage. But you know, you're going to lose some of that extended recording time with those. You will get raw and compressed raw images out of these. And Canon's new multifunction hot shoe. So the multifunction hot shoe is pretty cool. We did not get it in the R6 or the R5. We do have it on the R7, so you're going to have access to the like digital audio recording and stuff like that, where you can do it without a wire. And as touched on before, lackluster LPE17 battery life. The next camera on this list is another Canon, and one that is very near and dear to us. It is the Canon R7. It's an APS-C sensor, 32.5 megapixels, and that is a Digic-X processor as well. Great colors out of this thing, phenomenal image quality, and I would put the image quality of this camera up against my R5. The low light performance is obviously not as good, but the resolution, the detail that you're able to pull from it, the amount that you're able to crop in on some of these images, it is a very, very impressive little camera. It's light, it's portable, smaller body, and easier to manage than something like the R6 or the R5. But I will say it's almost too light with certain, like we have the 100 to 500, and it is a little bit too light for that front end heavy lens. I would never run like my EF70 to 200 third gen on this camera, just because it would feel weird. Super fast autofocus. It also has access to that new smart shoe. You do get raw and compressed raw images out of this camera. C-Log 3, HDR PQ. You're going to get 2 UHS 2 card slots out of this. So it does have some built-in redundancy, and we do use this as a professional camera, and as stated before, this is 9 times out of 10 my B cam for my R5. So the R6 will kind of get pushed to the side or get used as like the photography camera, and as we're doing videography and stuff like that, we'll run the R5 and the R7 together as a pair. R5 being my primary and the R7 being my secondary, and it's easy to match up colors, etc., etc. And this is going to have the LPE16 NHs, which will give you significantly better battery life than the R8. Out of these two, depending on which situation you're going into, like if you're looking to become a wedding photographer, you might want that full frame and that slightly better low light performance. If you're doing pretty much anything else, I would probably go with the R7. It's going to be more functional for most people. It's going to give you access to a lot of different types of photography, and I'm one of these photographers that's like, no niches, do it all, find what you like, and as you grow into your photographer, like being a photographer, then you can kind of steer down that path. But I don't see anything wrong with being a wedding photographer and a landscape photographer and a wildlife photographer and a videographer. So wear as many hats as you want to, and this camera is going to give you kind of access to do that. the next camera on the list is going to give you those same kind of benefits, and that is what we are filming on right now. We've talked about it a little bit earlier, and this is going to be probably choice number 2 on this list for me. So interchangeable, the R7 and the XS20. From a non-professional standpoint, these two cameras are, for different reasons, hold a special place in my heart. The Fujifilm XS20 is going to be a $1,299 camera. It is a 26.1 APS-C sensor, and that is an X-Trans 5, which is upgraded from the XS10 that we talked about earlier. I do think this is a pretty large upgrade from the XS10, just with the things that it offers and the flexibility of this camera. You're going to get 19 film simulations, 2 of which are going to be Eterna film simulations, and those are kind of highly sought after and look phenomenal. 6K open gate. So this is where the big upgrade from the XS20 comes in. If you're not familiar with what open gate is, it is essentially, most of these cameras will give you a 16:9 readout of when you're doing video. So you're not getting the full resolution of the sensor. So you can run 6.2 open gate, which is going to give you a readout from the full sensor. It makes cropping a lot easier. So if you're someone that produces content across multiple channels, like say YouTube and TikTok and Facebook and Instagram, it's a lot easier to crop from an open gate file versus a 16:9 file, and that's just because of how smushed that 16:9 is going to give you. It's also going to give you more resolution just because it's 6.2K. You do have access to F-Log, and I like F-Log. I think it's easy to color grade. It's honestly probably easier to color grade than the Canon. I'm able to throw stuff in there, and then you can apply some of the film simulations to that as well. 4K 60, and you're able to live stream at the 4K 60. I don't know why you would. 30 frames per second should be fine, but you can do it. And then 1080p to 240. So super high speed slow-mo. You are going to get 10-bit files out of this, 422, with the option for Apple ProRes RAW, and that's going to be external. But again, the fact that you can even do Apple ProRes RAW is awesome. And working with ProRes RAW files in something like DaVinci, and while you're working on a Mac, is going to be a night and day difference from like what you're typically used to working with. So super cool. As we've talked about before, this is a Fuji X mount. Going to give you a great selection of lenses like those Viltroxes that we talked about earlier, and via adapters, glass like EF glass. Great in-body image stabilization. I will say this. It can look jittery at times, and not so much that it's jarring, but you will catch it every once in a while. So probably not as smooth as something like the Lumix is, or even like the Canons, but it is functional, and it does a good job. Up to 30 frames per second, raw photos, but it does buffer at 28, so you're not even going to get the full 1 second of shooting with that. But that is a higher frame rate than you're going to see from a lot of cameras. It is intelligent hybrid autofocus, so phase and contrast detect, which you're going to see from pretty much every camera at this price point. And then you are going to get all intra, which is your 10-bit, and you're going to get long op. So extended record times with that long op codec. Super cool. This is, like I said, it's a great camera. I have zero complaints about this thing. It's light, it's sturdy. It just makes sense. And with it's basically a baby XH2S and $1,000 cheaper. If you're looking for an overall like content creation camera, photo camera, video camera, kind of does it all, I would suggest going with this, or potentially our next camera, which is another Sony, and we've seen a ton of those on this list at this point. The next one is going to be another APS-C. It is the A6700. So this is, I think, the newest camera on this list. It's going to come in at $1,398, so $1,398. So also one of the more expensive ones on this list, but it's worth it. Gives you a lot, and Sony colors are cinematic, you know? that word that everyone hates to use now. 26 megapixel APS-C sensor. Backside illuminated, which you're not going to see a whole lot of, especially at this price point. But that is the way that things need to be going now. It does help with the dynamic range. Up to 4K 60 downsampled from 6K, and that is all intra, so 10-bit recording. And you get long GOP as well, so extended record times in the H.265 codec. 4K 120, so you will get slow-mo on this, high speed, whatever you want to call it. Access to S-Log 3, so flexibility with your dynamic range and with your like getting a flat profile. It does have IBIS, 5-axis. That's pretty much the standard at this point. Very fast, industry standard hybrid autofocus, phase and contrast detect, and a lot of these things are probably getting to the point where they're repetitive, and they're feeling repetitive to me. So sorry if I'm droning, but it is a single UHS 2 card slot, lacking the redundancy. Bummer. Capable of streaming, and it does have that Sony multi-interface shoe, so you can do the wireless audio recording and anything that functions with a multi-interface hot shoe. This is kind of an honorable mention, and I felt like I needed to include it only because it is cheap right now compared to when it released. And that is the Sony A7III. So that's going to be a full frame camera. I'm not going to cover all the specs just because I don't feel like it, to put it bluntly. So look them up. It's an older camera. This, in its day, was a hybrid beast. It did everything. It's good. 4K, I think it does like 4K 30, and it's a 24 megapixels full frame sensor or something like that. I'd take the 6700 over this one. It would have felt wrong to not include it and at least put that little bug in your ear to go check it out. So it may be for you. We got 2 left. I promise. We're almost there. And if you made it this far, that means that you like listening to me talk and yap, and you're probably a fan of the channel by now, right? And if you are, hit that subscribe button and like this if the video gave you any kind of information that was helpful. I would like to hear you guys sound off in the comments if you want to see some used ones, because used is going to give you a lot of value for what you're paying, and camera prices drop like crazy. So let me know if you want to see a used version of the cameras that you should buy in 2024 as a beginner or intermediate photographer. So just as a heads up and to make everyone aware here, we were about an hour and 15, maybe an hour and 30 minutes straight into recording, and I did get a overheating warning on the XS20, so something to consider there. That's longer than I get on my R6 or my R5, so I think that's pretty good, and we're still on the same battery. So just food for thought while we're here talking about things. As I was saying, there are 2 cameras left in this category, and that's going to wrap up the video. And I know I've been long-winded and I've been talking a lot here, but wanted to cover like all the best cameras that I could possibly think of for you guys. So last 2 cameras up are going to be a combo of a Nikon and a Lumix. And covering first, we are going to have the Nikon Z6 II. So this is the Mark II version of the Nikon Z6. It's going to come in at $1,596.95, so kind of right at the top of this budget tier here. You're going to get a lot with this, though. So this is a 24.5 megapixel full frame sensor. It's going to shoot up to 14 frames per second, and that is at the full resolution. The buffer on this is 124 frames. So this, I know a lot of wildlife photographers use this camera. There's quite a few that I follow on Instagram and TikTok that this is their go-to camera. It's compact enough to carry out into the field. The colors are beautiful on it, and getting a full 14 frames per second out of a mechanical shutter and having that high of a buffer, you're going to get a lot of usable images out of that. It is only 8-bit video internally. I think you can get 10-bit recording externally out of it. So this is more of a photography forward camera, not so much a hybrid, but it is going to give you some video features. You're going to get 4K 30 out of it. Again, not the highest frame rate that we've seen, but for most situations this is going to be usable. And a 1080p 120, so some useful slow-mo out of it. It's going to have a single CF Express Type B slot and one UHS 2 slot, so built-in redundancy, great for, you know, professional work. It does have a 30-minute record limit, so content creator or a situation like this where we've been recording for over an hour straight, you know, with outtakes and these long-winded video sessions, that's going to be kind of a moot point. It does have phase detect autofocus, and this is highly improved over the other Canons that or the other Nikons that we've talked about previously in this video. So this does have a new generation of algorithm for the autofocusing. From what I've heard, this is significantly improved. It's still not quite up to like the Z8 or the Z9, or definitely like the Sonys or the Canons, but from what I've been seeing, you're not going to have a lot of missed shots or anything like that. I mean, autofocus on all these mirrorless cameras is better than one would expect. So, as I stated earlier, this is going to be a pretty good wildlife camera. Nikon has a good choice of lenses. They have good colors. I really like all the raw files that I've seen from Canons. You know, I always have Canon on the brain because that's where my heart lies. But the Nikons have really good color science. They are very pleasing. I want to say they kind of lean more like warmer tones and stuff like that. Just something to consider. You're going to have very malleable images, 14-bit RAWs, blah, blah, blah. So this is where I would go if I was a wildlife shooter looking to get into like a full-frame system. I know a lot of wedding photographers use Nikon as well. I personally would go the Canon route just because we are hybrid shooters, and if you're wanting to like kind of do that content creation and maybe throw in some video or, you know, minute-long clips, something like that, that's kind of more the route that I would lean. So photo forward more on this camera, but you will get by with the video features that it has by any means. That's going to kind of close this out. I think this is a great camera, not just my personal preference, that's all. And finishing out this list, 24 cameras we have covered here. This has been a long-winded video and probably the longest one that I've ever produced. This is the most I've had to talk, so bear with me. It's getting better every time, you know? But we have another Panasonic on the list, and this is the first full-frame Panasonic that we have, and I believe it is on sale right now around the like $1,600 mark. It is the Lumix S5 II. So there are two S5 Mark IIs. There's the S5 Mark II, like the OG, and the S5 II X. This is not the X. The X is going to be more video-centric, and it's also going to be significantly more expensive. I think it's like $400 to $500 more than this one. That is not to negate the fact that the S5 II is a brilliant camera. It is going to be a 24.2 megapixel full-frame sensor. You get access to the Leica L-mount glass. So Leica has probably the best glass on the market. I would say Leica and Canon are up there as far as consumer level lenses, but Leica's probably going to edge out Canon on this. They're sharp, they're fast, the build quality is phenomenal on Leica, and it's Leica. You know, there's just something, Leica, just saying that you're using Leica just holds some weight to it. Dual UHS 2 card slots, so access to those V90s, faster file uploads, all of that stuff, and I do believe the UHS 2s are slightly more reliable as well. You know, if you have the option to take a UHS 2, do that. 6K 30 in 10-bit, so best video spec that we've seen, you know, straight 6K, not even a 4K downsampled from 6K. This is a straight 6K 30. You're probably never going to need that, but it's there just in case. 4K 60, 10-bit, 422, unlimited record time, so you're not going to get that overheating. You're not going to get, you know, the warning of, ooh, you're at 29 minutes and 30 seconds. wrap this shit up. You're going to get 1080p at 180 frames per second, so that's pretty cool. Functional slow-mo, and that's going to bring you down to like, I think 20% if you're running 24 frames per second. Vlog and V-gamut. So full Vlog, you get the however many stops of dynamic range that you get off of the full Vlog, and the V-gamut. So full color grades, if you really want to delve into like actual cinematic color grading, you have the option of that with this camera. 6.5 stops of in-body image stabilization, and I think Lumix has probably the best in-body image stabilization on the market. Sony's probably a close second with their gyrometer, gyroscoping, whatever their algorithm is that keeps all that information in the camera. But I think the just straight optical stabilization, Lumix is probably going to give you the best that you can get on the market. Dust and splash resistant, so it has that weather sealing and all that. Improved hybrid autofocus over the other Lumixes that we've talked about on this list. So it is going to be phase and contrast, and this is, I think, the newest iteration of the autofocusing system that Lumix offers. And once again, the only camera system that you're going to see in this list that offers this, anamorphic support. So it is going to offer the D-squeezes. You will be able to shoot anamorphic lenses on this, and it is, fully kitted out to show you what your image will look like on the screen. That is it. I know we've covered a lot of information here. I have probably talked myself to death, but I wanted to make sure to include every possible scenario and not just give you guys like a top 5 or a top 10, because there's a lot of cameras out there, and there's a lot of cameras that do a lot of different things, and we are kind of a no-niche photographer company here. We do wildlife, we do landscape, and I wanted to kind of touch on all of those things and where I would put my money in different niches of photography. We are a kind of a Canon company, and that's not to say that we are Canon loyal, but Canon works for what we do with most of our professional work. And you know that I love my Fujifilms as well, but Olympus has provided some cameras that are really interesting to me. If we would go to a fully video company or anything like that, I'd probably go the Lumix route. If we went to a fully photocentric company, I might end up looking at Nikons. So I wanted to cover, a variety of sample of different types of cameras and allow you guys to choose what you think is more important to you. As you've noticed, as we've covered all this stuff, I didn't have any kind of like biases or anything like that. And I hope that you guys go into this looking the same. We're in the Canon ecosystem because that's what we had handed down to us when we first started. And if you have access to lenses that are maybe hand-me-downs or ones that you can adapt to certain cameras, that might be something to consider, because lenses are arguably more important than the bodies once you get to a certain point. And over the past probably 15 or 20 years, we haven't seen, from a photographic standpoint, from video is a whole different situation, but from a photographic standpoint, we haven't seen jumps forward like leaps and bounds in image quality. There's been 45 megapixel sensors for a while now. There's been, high resolution, etc., where I think you're getting your money's worth now is functionality and ease of use, and then dynamic range is a big thing, and autofocus is a big thing, but these are things to consider. So you're not going to get a bad image out of a camera just because it's 5 years old. You might have an easier time getting that image out of a newer camera or a more expensive camera. But don't think just because you're not spending $2,000 or $3,000 on a camera that you're not going to be a good photographer because of it, because that's not the case. Practice, learn your camera, find what's in your budget, and find what is going to offer you the specs and the little quirks that will work for what you want to do. That being said, thank you guys if you've made it this far. I know this was a long one, and I'm glad if you're still here. I appreciate it. As we always say, like, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Let me know what you think. And let me know what kind of cameras you guys are looking at whether it be for the holidays. We're kind of like post Black Friday here. And what do you plan on taking pictures of? That's it. It's been Logan here with Grand Media, and we're out. All right, guys, real quick before I jump all the way off here, I have compiled a list from Adorama, which we are an affiliate with, down below in the description. If you could click on those links if you plan on purchasing any of these cameras, it really helps. We get a little bit of kickback from that. It doesn't cost you anything extra. You're still going to get the best prices in the market. So yeah, down below, click those links, and all 24 of them are going to be on there.